Maybe we start with the beginning of time. In the mid-80s and early 90s, we all still remember the so-called Four Dragons. Singapore also do not want to be left behind. Started its own journey in a startup, and that sort of beginning of the journey.
There were many activities and programs, mostly led by government, of course. There were smaller investment firms, there were traditional founders, maybe call it the Web 1.0 kind of guys, right? They were doing activities.
But unfortunately, we were faced with challenges, which is dot-com bubble burst. That created a lot of naysayers, and eventually that put that whole startup ecosystem on the hold.
The part where it really started to feel real was around the 2011-2012 period, where you suddenly could feel like, oh wow, okay, there are companies being built, there are legit programs that the government is doing, whether it's funding programs or matching programs or grants, and people were really starting to think, hey, if I get out of school, maybe I should start a company, maybe I should join a startup. It's like one of those things where it's like a gradual out of nowhere, like, oh, no ecosystem, and then suddenly out of nowhere, there's an ecosystem there, right?
I would say if there was one event on hindsight that triggered it, it was probably the then president of NUS when he launched the NUS Overseas College program. The concept was to send entrepreneurial undergraduate students into overseas startup hubs like Silicon Valley, like Boston, like Stockholm, Tel Aviv, and get these young kids to be interned into the startups there. Many of the kids who went through the NOC program, when they came back to Singapore, enough of them started companies, and eventually one or two of them succeeded. That to me seeded the rebirth of our startup ecosystem.
I never wanted to start a company. My mindset was like, okay, I graduate and apply for a big company. And then the NUS Overseas College banner came in. At the age of 16, I did a 2-week study tour to go to Silicon Valley. Life-changing experience. Day to day, right, there was a different way of looking at everything. Everywhere you went, every corner you turn, everyone you speak to, there's always this thing of like, what are you working on? Are there new ideas that you're exploring? Did you see what that guy launched the other day? There was this perpetual support on each other's ideas in their work. Ideas were built upon, not torn down. Oh, I know 5 other people that you should talk to, right? And they will love what you're doing. I remember I would actually start my day waking up, reading about TechCrunch. There's always this incessant desire, an obsession around, what cool new stuff had come out. Everybody emanates that culture. I think that was very powerful. You really could feel that you can change the world. That your ideas have meaning, that if you put something out there, right, the world would give a shit.
I would ask friends at NUS Enterprise to arrange for me to meet with the NOC students. And 1 or 2 of them said this to me that I can still remember to this day. They said, look, when he went there, he realized that, hey, actually those kids in Stanford were not much smarter than they were. They were not that much hungrier or capable. Why is it that they're able to raise $1 million off 5 PowerPoint slides? Why can't we do it? There's nothing so supremely special about them. We can do as well.
When I went there, I learned very, very quickly, right, that actually, if you want to solve big problems and you want to make an impact, right, they are actually best done with smaller teams. So I think then completely my mindset changed. And that's the exact culture that we wanted to replicate here. The real big goal, right, is where companies that were being built over here could become global brands. Founders are able to build companies to solve global problems in a sustainable manner. In the early days of E27, we would literally be doing anything and everything under the sun as long as it fit into building tech ecosystem. The garage back in NUS where we had the incubator, right? We would regularly have drinking sessions, brainstorming sessions. We would stay there over the weekend sometime just to think of ideas or build on ideas. Connecting together was a huge part, a lot of parties and drinking, and anytime anyone remotely connected to Silicon Valley was in town, whether is it a friend or a friend's friend, right? We would blow it up as though some major idol was in town. And then we invite the whole world and then make it like a huge celebration and awe and wonder. We were working with these big companies, your Facebooks, your Googles, the FANGs of the day, and the responses were always amazing. We would have maybe 300-400 people participating. These people would sometimes queue up, they would force their way into events, they would sit on the floor, wherever they could, right? They would want to be part of it, right? So I think there was a lot of naivety in that idol worship that we had with Silicon Vallly, and part of it, of course, was pumped by us. But there was also that deep, innate, raw excitement and that hope, right, that everything we were doing today would lead to something phenomenal down the road.
The biggest challenge is in the early days in Singapore, it's more fashionable to join MNC. Only loser join startup because they can't make it in the MNC. So when you're trying to talk to people, they ask you what you're doing. I studied this company called Mediaring.com. What does it do now? By the time you finish the second sentence, the guy already walked away. This guy's a loser. So can you imagine you go from the Silicon Valley where every day, every night people talking about new ideas, and then next day you come back to a steel mill. You feel like you're traveling back in time 50 years suddenly.
There were still more people who doubted that startups could actually become a vehicle for economic growth. We were in the role of the underdogs and trying to convince the powers that be that, the startup ecosystem is emerging. Please give us your support. And by the way, it's not just from government colleagues or Ministry of Finance or anyone. It was also amongst the parents, right? Fellow citizens who were scoffing at a startup business plan that says that they're not going to make money until year 3, year 5, right?
I remember meeting people from Silicon Valley who would come over, we have lunch, and then they were like, but there are no VCs, there's no talent, there's not much internet access in these other markets. Southeast Asia is very fragmented. I heard Silicon Valley people say that Singapore as an ecosystem won't make it. But for people within the ecosystem, right, we were always like, but this can be solved. We had a more long-term growth mindset view of this issue. I also realized that if I wanted to live in an environment that has a thriving tech ecosystem, I needed to build the ecosystem myself and work with the stakeholders to do that.
You asked what we did to try and change that mindset. I don't think, it's not one or two incidents, right? It's a continuous effort to promote, to market, to identify. We do everything from doing media interviews like this, to highlight successful companies, right? Even down to going one-on-one with parents of potential startup founders. In the early days, the decision on which first-time founder to give our grant to was made by government officials, right? People like me who think we know better. So I remember this one time when my colleagues sent me a memo for approval to these bunch of fresh graduates from NUS who had this idea to come up with a cashback Groupon type of e-commerce platform. And back then I was thinking, how are they going to go up against the giants, right? So I said, no, this is don't waste taxpayers' money. That was still the instinct of a government official. But you fast forward a few years, and I remember joining on a visit to Block 71. And then he visited this same company, and proudly framed on their wall was a rejection letter from Spring Singapore signed by yours truly. And then the founder shared with the minister how that inspired him to prove this silly government official wrong. And then today, these guys are, I think they recently raised several, significant funding rounds, northwards of 100 million, and they're on the way to a unicorn. That to me was one of those aha moments for me, right? It rammed home to me, right, how government officials instinctively should not be the ones to make this sort of high-risk grant allocation. Not to say that we don't know. I mean, government officials, we are not unintelligent. It's just that the structure sometimes prevents us from taking that risk. And it's just a mismatch of instincts and skill sets, I suppose. In order for a startup ecosystem to flourish and survive, where things are so uncertain, risk is so high, you probably have to trust those who have experience and track record. They probably have a better feel for what could potentially be a successful startup than we can. And so that was the change that we made to our grant programs to work with investors, accelerators, incubators with the right track record and the right setup to pick winners for us. As they say, it takes a village to raise a child. In this case, it takes an entire city to raise successful startups. And it takes all this combined effort to help to change mindsets.
I think we have done a great job, right, in building our own identity. I think the old school playbook was that every tech ecosystem needed to be like Silicon Valley. But I think if you look at where we are today, everyone has a unique flavor, unique style and positioning to what it is to be a thriving tech ecosystem. I think Singapore's unique flavor and culture is very multifaceted, right? Like, it has definitely positioned itself as a trusted ecosystem. If you go out and fundraise and you say you're from Singapore and you're a Singapore-funded company, investors are way more excited and open to giving you capital. It's a trusted place to do business, it's a trusted place to build your company, and it's also a very trusted place to raise capital. And I think not many ecosystems around the world, right, can very confidently say that.
We are no one's Silicon Valley. Singapore is Singapore. We are an emerging startup node with peaks of excellence in some sectors, but secondary peaks that are still emerging and developing. And we still have to work hard at it to remain relevant to the region and to the world.